Welcome to the second of our videos of the classical and medieval era of Britain. In this video, we'll be looking at the Roman invasion. So as we established in the introduction video, the Romans were conquerors and they took over many places through force of arms and violence. They often exploited problems with local groups, and they tried to use local rivalries to their advantage. The first significant contact the Romans had with the British Isles was in 54 AD, and a small party of soldiers landed on the shores. This was led by a man who later became pretty infamous, Julius Caesar. At that time, he was just an officer, and he wanted to explore the islands to see if they were suitable for expansion to the Roman Empire. So there were rumors that the islands were rich in minerals and land, especially land that could be farmed. So they landed with a small force of men. At the time, the Roman Empire was expanding further into Europe, and it wanted to rule as much land as possible. The Roman Empire suspected that the British Isles were rich, but they really wanted to investigate the political situation with the local tribes and see if they could use that to their advantage. Initially, the Romans were driven away by the local tribes. Yet, despite this defeat, it was a popular event in Rome and eventually led to the emperor at the time, Emperor Claudius, preparing for a full-scale invasion in 43 AD. In 43 AD, the Romans arrived again, and this time they were more prepared and they took control of most of the islands. The Roman campaign was brutal, and there were many people that hated the Romans from that point. The Romans took advantage of the fact that while many tribes hated them, they hated each other more than the Romans. And they made alliances with one tribe against the other. So this was a tactic the Romans had used many times to conquer lands. The strategy the Romans used to conquer the British Isles took three phases. They would land with an army large enough to secure a base. They would then talk to the local tribes about who would be willing to make alliances and who would resist them. The second phase, they would support local friendly tribes to defeat their enemies, and they would attack and they would suppress any who resisted them. The third phase was to allow the friendly tribes to rule their land and pay taxes to Rome and follow Roman law. Over time, the idea was that the land became Romanized through migration, settlement, and cultural influences. So the changes that the Romans brought to the British Isles were numerous. Architecturally, the Romans built long, straight roads, they built sewers, central heating, and they used stone in construction of buildings, perhaps for the first time. Many of the cities that are still around today were actually started by the Romans. So cities like London, Manchester, etc. And the way of governing was not that different from the places in Europe that the Romans ruled already. So in effect, the British Isles had become a Roman province. Other changes the Romans brought came through culture, religion, and economics. So as the British Isles needed to trade with other Roman provinces, money and coins were introduced to help trade. So instead of previous trading practices that involved trading items for similar value items, coinage made trade much easier and safer. The merchants could carry larger amounts of coin. They didn't have to take livestock or anything with them. So it was much easier for trade in that way. Because Rome was tolerant of many religions, they introduced their own Roman religious gods, and then later they introduced Christianity to the British Isles. Religion itself played an important part in the British Isles because it was mainly used to help keep people happy. Being able to follow the religion of your home country allowed migrants to the British Isles to settle in easier. So we can see evidence from that time. Even today, we have pottery and we have coins that show the Roman rule and also show the many religious practices and gods around at the time. A huge cultural change was the use of Latin as the language used to talk to people. People were allowed their local dialects, but Latin was necessary to learn also. Latin was also used to keep records of the everyday running of towns, businesses, and disputes. So if you were a merchant or some kind of leader, you would need to have learned Latin along with your local dialect. The Romans themselves liked to keep records of everything. And of course, this was done in Latin. So the Romans didn't have it all easy. They didn't have an easy time at all, especially in the beginning. There were rebellions, and there was one major uprising in 60 AD. So this rebellion was led by a female leader named Boudicca. She united the many tribes that were attacked by the Romans when they first arrived, so those that resisted the Romans. She was a fierce warrior and a good leader, and she actually took many settlements from the Romans, including London. In fact, she actually had the larger army, and she pushed the Romans back. Eventually, though, the Romans gathered in large enough numbers that they decided they wanted to fight her in battle. So the Romans were indeed smaller in number, but they had better tactics and weapons, and they eventually defeated her and her warriors. So this was significant in that it was the last major uprising of the Roman occupation. So during the Roman occupation, they managed to occupy most of the British Isles, but they did have problems with the northern parts of what is now Scotland, and they never really controlled that region. The problems were with two aspects: the environment and the local tribes that lived there. So the north of Scotland is very mountainous, and the environment is difficult for the Romans to fight in their preferred tactic and formation. The Romans like to fight on flat land. So it was better suited to the single warrior that the pair of warriors that the Romans used. Also, the tribe who lived there were generically called the Picts, and they knew how to use the mountainous terrain well. They were tall, they were powerful, and they held against the Romans. Actually, eventually the Romans gave up altogether trying to conquer this region, and they built a wall to separate this land from theirs. So this wall is called Hadrian's Wall, after the emperor at the time, Emperor Hadrian. And you can actually still see evidence of the wall today. So ultimately, the Roman conquest was successful for many years. It introduced culture, architecture, and really a new way to keep records. We can see the Roman motivation for taking the land to try to control as much territory as possible, to keep your empire well fed and well paid, and of course to keep your armies experienced in battle and the soldiers paid for.